Welcome, and thank you for joining today's conference, Grantee Learning Series for COVID-19 Relief Programs, Grant Administration. Before we begin, please ensure you've opened the WebEx chat panel by using the associated icon on the bottom right corner of your screen. Please note that all audio connections will be muted until the Q&A portion of the call. You are, however, welcome to submit written questions throughout the presentation, and these will be addressed during Q&A. To submit your questions in writing, select all panelists from the drop-down menu in the chat panel, enter your question in the message box provided, and send. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded. If you require technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer. With that, I'm going to turn the conference over to Sandra Dason, Group Leader in the Office of State and Grantee Relations. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Tegan. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for setting time aside today to join us for our Grantee Learning Series Grants Administration webinar. I'm Sandy Dason, and I'm a Group Leader in the Office of State and Grantee Relations. The Grantee Learning Series is comprised of 5 webinars held each Wednesday afternoon, beginning today through August 23rd. These webinars are designed to provide a forum for the department to share important information and resources with our grantees to support your implementation of the ESSER, GEER, and EANS programs. These webinars are designed to orient new grantee staff, while the programs are also here to support grantee staff who have been working on these programs over the last several years. This afternoon, I am joined by my colleagues, Christopher Tate, who is a group leader in the Office of State and Grantee Relations, and he works to oversee all grants administration and monitoring within our office. We're also joined today by Jennifer Timmons, who's a program officer that leads several aspects of grants administration. They have prepared a recorded webinar to provide an overview of the grants administration for the ESSER, GEER, and EANS programs. What we're going to do is we're going to play the recorded webinar, and we are going to open it up at the end so that you can ask any questions. Throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, please also feel free to enter any questions you have into the chat. Without further delay, we're going to play the recording for you.
Hello, I'm Christopher Tate, the group leader responsible for managing the technical aspects of the administration of grants in the Office of State and Grantee Relations. We are the office that manages the U.S. Department of Education's pre-K through 12 pandemic relief programs. I'm joined today by my colleague, Jennifer Timmons. Jennifer, a former district Title I administrator, comes to this work with a significant amount of federal grant implementation experience and is a key resource to your state's program officer in supporting you as you implement your programs. Today's webinar within the Grantee Learning Series is designed to provide new program staff with an overview of the technical aspects of managing the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, ESSER, the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, GEER, and the Emergency Assistance to Non-Public Schools program, commonly referred to as EANS. This first part in our 5-part series is intended to provide a framework for understanding and managing these programs' grants. It will highlight key resources that are available to you in managing your award from the U.S. Department of Education. During our session today, we want to accomplish 2 objectives. First, we will review the legislative and regulatory requirements for administering the ESSER, GEER, and EANS programs, and also touch upon the department's guidance for administering the programs. Then, we will review the life cycle of these programs' grants and touch on the different resources available to support your management of your programs. Some key features of administering these unique grants and different requirements will be touched on today. However, future sessions in the series, such as the session on reporting and also on monitoring, will explore those requirements in greater depth. Today's presentation is shaped around the grant lifecycle. We will start by touching upon the legislation authorizing each of the 3 COVID relief education programs and detail the early implementation of the programs. However, Since the project period for CARES funds has ended and the project period for SERSA funds ends on September 30th this year, we will dedicate a significant portion of today's agenda to the administration of these programs during the later phases of the grant lifecycle, including the grant closeout and the liquidation of funds after the project period ends. The Education Stabilization Fund, or ESF, that we'll be discussing today include the ESSER, GEER, and EANS funds authorized by the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, CARES Act, the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations, SERSA Act, and the American Rescue Plan. It's important to note with any discussion of ESF funds that due to the awarding timelines of these grants, grantees and subrecipients will be implementing the requirements simultaneously. Unlike other federal grants that may have repeated funding year after year stemming from the same legislation with consistent requirements and guidance that may allow for a general accounting practice of first in, first out, the timelines of these funds intersect in such a way to necessitate equal attention to each of the funding sources simultaneously. In addition, while the requirements may be similar between iterations of funds, there are many significant differences from one authorization to another that grantees must be aware of during implementation, and we will take a look at some of those today. Jennifer?
Thank you, Christopher. The life cycle of a federal formula grant begins with the congressional authorization and appropriation of a particular program. Once this occurs, funding announcements are made to grantees to indicate the availability and associated requirements of the authorized funding. And this is considered the pre-award phase of the grant. During the pre-award phase, the requirements to apply for and obtain an award are made available. And once grantees have submitted any required documents such as state plans or assurances and certifications, and once the department has reviewed and provided approval of the state submission, the funds are awarded and that award period begins. It's important to note that auditing, reporting, and monitoring activities are ongoing throughout the entirety of the grant's life cycle and continue after the close of the period of performance. Today, we'll be using this framework of the grant's life cycle to guide our discussions of responsibilities and resources for the ESF awards authorized through the CARES, SERSA, and ARP Acts, beginning with the authorization and pre-award phases. In 2020 and 2021, the Congress passed and the President signed into law 3 major COVID relief bills as part of the Education Stabilization Fund, or ESF funds, that provided funding to K-12 education. In March 2020, the CARES Act provided $13.2 billion for the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Funds, or ESSER, and $3 billion for the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, often referred to as GEER. These funds were specifically targeted for use by states to prevent, prepare for, and respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. In December 2020, the Congress passed and the President signed into law another COVID relief bill, the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations, or SERSA Act. Under the SERSA Act, an additional $54.3 billion was appropriated for the ESSER program, and the SERSA Act also provided an additional $4 billion for the GEER program, and LEAs, institutions of higher education, and education-related entities continue to be eligible subrecipients. Like CARES, ESSER, and GEER, SERSA funds can be used for a variety of activities to address the impact of the pandemic. Under SERSA, $2.75 billion of the governor's GEER allocation is dedicated to a new program, the Emergency Assistance to Non-Public Schools, or EANS program. State education agencies, or SEAs, administer the EANS program, and priority for services and assistance is provided to non-public schools that enroll low-income students and are most impacted by COVID-19. Finally, the American Rescue Plan, or ARP Act, which was approved by Congress and signed into law in March 2021, provides $122 billion for the ESSER program and $2.75 billion for the EANS program. Let's take a closer look at the awarding of funds and the timelines for each iteration of those funds. The CARES period of performance began in spring 2020 and ended September 30th, 2022. Grantees and subrecipients could continue to liquidate properly obligated funds through January 28th, 2023, unless the grantee had applied for and received approval to extend its liquidation period. Currently, the CARES Act awards are in a period of manual closeout, though reporting and monitoring activities are continuing. These funds will revert to the Treasury 4 years after the end of the period of performance in October 2026. In order to apply for and obtain funds, states were required under both the ESSER and GEER awards to provide signed certification and agreement documents that provided specific state information. As there was no requirement under the CARES Act to submit a state plan for either the ESSER or GEER award programs, amendments were not required. The awarding of SGR funds and the associated period of performance began in January 2021 and will end September 30th, 2023. Grantees and subrecipients can continue to liquidate properly obligated funds through January 28th, 2024, unless the grantee applies for, and receives approval to extend its liquidation period. Absent an approved extension, SGR awards will enter into a period of suspension and manual closeout in February 2024, though again, reporting and monitoring activities will continue. These funds will then revert to the Treasury 4 years after the end of that SGR period of performance in October 2027. In order to apply for and obtain funds, states were required under both the CARES, ESSER, and GEER awards to provide signed certification and agreement documents, as we just said, that provided that specific state information. These CNA documents also apply to the SGR, ESSER, and GEER awards, with a few exceptions, which will be discussed a little bit later. As with the CARES awards, there's no requirement under SGR, ESSER, or GEER to submit amendments. Now, in order for a state to apply for and obtain funding under SGR EANS, states were again required to submit a certification and agreement. Finally, the American Rescue Plan, or ARP Act, which was approved by Congress and signed into law in March 2021, provides $122 billion for the ESSER program and $2.75 billion for the EANS program. The awarding of these funds and their associated period of performance began in March 2021 and will end September 30th, 2024. Grantees and subrecipients, again, can continue to liquidate properly obligated funds through January 28th, 2025. And these awards will enter into a period of suspension and manual closeout in February 2025, though, once again, reporting and monitoring activities will continue throughout the entirety of those periods. These funds will then revert to the Treasury 4 years after the end of the ARP period of performance in October 2028. ARP ESSER has some additional requirements that were not part of CARES or SGR ESSER, including the requirement of state education agencies to submit plans to the department outlining how they plan to use the ARP ESSER funds to address learning loss and support summer and after-school programming. The SEA plan had to include information on how the state would support LEA efforts to combat learning loss, and LEAs also had to submit use of funds plans to their SEAs. State plans were also required to receive ARP EANS funds, though the program is very similar to the SGR EANS program with some significant exceptions that we'll look at a little bit later. During that pre-award phase, the requirements to apply for and obtain an award are made available. And once grantees have submitted any required documents, such as the state plans and assurances and certifications we've just discussed, and once the department again has reviewed and provided approval of the state submission, those funds are awarded and the award period begins. During the award period, or the program period, there are a number of tasks that grantees will be required to undertake, and these will generally be listed within the grant's assurances. Additional information is usually provided by the department through guidance documents such as frequently asked questions or FAQs, or through specific grantee communications to assist with program implementation. The award period includes that period of time when grantees and subrecipients may obligate funds for allowable expenses to implement the program, again, per the certification and agreements or the assurances. Of particular note, again, is the requirement of grantees to continually monitor the implementation of subawards made to their subgrantees or their subrecipients, and includes both formal and informal monitoring activities, as well as the technical assistance that would be provided to subrecipients throughout the period of performance or the implementation period of the grant and any of its associated subawards. While time doesn't allow for an extended review of all requirements included within the ESSER, GEER, and EANS programs of the CARES, SRSA, and ARP Acts, we will take a general look at the programmatic, legislative, and regulatory requirements of each program. The CARES Act ESSER funds were to be used by states and local education agencies, or LEAs, to support a variety of activities aimed at addressing the impact that COVID-19 has had and continues to have on elementary and secondary schools, including for any activities that might be authorized by the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or ESEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act, the Carl D. Perkins Career and Technical Assistance or Technical Education Act, and Subtitle B of Title VII of the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. Allocations of CARES ESSER were provided to states in the same proportion as the state received funds under Part A of the Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in fiscal year 2019. SEAs, or state educational agencies, could reserve up to 10% of the CARES ESSER funds for state level activities, while at least 90% had to be allocated to local educational agencies, or LEAs. And LEAs that received those CARES ESSER funds were required under the CARES Act to provide equitable services to non-public schools and students. These requirements, along with others, can be found in the CARES ESSER Certification and Agreement, often called the CNA document. Remember that under both CARES ESSER and SRSA ESSER, state plans were not required, but grantees should access the CNA documents to ensure compliance with program assurances. Under the SRSA Act, an additional $54.3 billion was appropriated for the ESSER program, and SRSA ESSER funds can be used for the same broad purposes as CARES ESSER, and the states and LEAs were encouraged to use SRSA ESSER funds to safely reopen schools, measure and effectively address significant learning loss, and take other actions to mitigate the impact of COVID-19. Similar to CARES ESSER, SEAs can reserve up to 10% for state level activities, while at least 90% of those funds must be distributed to local education agencies, or LEAs. The CNA documents for the CARES Award also apply to the SRSA awards with a few exceptions, notably the equitable services provisions, which are only required under the CARES programs. LEAs that received SRSA ESSER or GEER funds were not required to provide equitable services to non-public schools because Congress had authorized that new program, the Emergency Assistance to Non-Public Schools, or the EANS program, to provide that aid. In accepting ESSER or GEER funds, the states also agreed to comply with the CARES Act maintenance of effort requirements. And while those requirements are slightly different under the SRSA Act, a state, by accepting the funds, does agree to also comply with the SRSA Act maintenance of effort requirements. There's another Grantee Learning Series webinar dedicated to the maintenance of effort requirements, so we won't go into detail about those requirements today, but please do take a look at your CNA documents for additional information. ARP ESSER has some additional requirements that were not part of CARES or SRSA ESSER. First, while state education agencies may reserve up to 10% of the state's ARP ESSER allocation, at least 5% must be used to support the implementation of evidence-based interventions aimed specifically at addressing learning loss, such as summer learning or summer enrichment, extended day, comprehensive after-school programs, extended school year programs, etc. In addition, at least 1% must be used to support evidence-based summer enrichment programs and 1% for evidence-based comprehensive after-school programs. Secondly, LEAs must reserve at least 20% of their funds to address learning loss through the implementation of evidence-based interventions and ensure that those interventions respond to students' social, emotional, and academic needs, as well as address the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on underrepresented student groups. In addition, an LEA that receives ESSER funds must, within 30 days of receiving those funds, make publicly available on its website a plan for their safe return to in-person instruction and the continuity of services. And before making that plan publicly available, the LEA must seek public comment on that plan. SEAs were required to submit plans to the department outlining how they're going to use ESSER funds to address learning loss and support summer and after-school programs. And the SEA also had to include information on how the state would support LEA efforts to combat learning loss. LEAs also had to submit use of funds plans to their SEAs and make those available. In addition, states that accepted ESSER funds agreed to meet the ARP Act's maintenance of equity requirements. And again, more detail on those requirements will be provided in a different webinar. Additional state and LEA requirements related to the ESSER state and local plans can be found within the interim final rule requirement, or IFR. The IFR further details the requirements for meaningful consultation and public input to the state and local plans. Additional requirements related to the LEA's safe return to in-person instruction and continuity of services is also included. The state plans were required in order to receive access to the ESSER funds, and those approved plans are posted on the linked website, as well as the state's links to all of those local plans that had to be posted publicly. Now, of particular note within the SEA's plan components is Section D, maximizing state level funds to support students. This section of the SEA's plan outlines the state required reservations of funds for the academic impact of lost instructional time, which is Section D1. Section D2 is the evidence-based summer learning and enrichment programs, and Section D3 is the evidence-based comprehensive after-school programs. And then Section D4 is an optional reservation for emergency needs. If a state determines that changes are needed to its original approved plan in Sections D1, D2, or D3 that detail the required reservations, a state should submit a plan amendment to their assigned program officer through the state mailbox. And we've linked the amendment requirements that are required for that amendment there, but certainly ask any questions of your program officer if you have any questions about that process. The CARES Act GEER funds were provided to each state on the basis of a formula that includes student-aged population and poverty levels. And governors could award subgrants to local education agencies, institutions of higher education, or education-related entities. And GEER funds could be used to support a variety of activities to address the impact of the coronavirus pandemic that it has had and continues to have on students and families across the nation. Similar to CARES ESSER, LEAs that received CARES Act GEER funds were required to provide equitable services to non-public schools and students. And just as with CARES ESSER in accepting GEER funds, states also had to comply with the CARES Act maintenance of effort requirements, which will be discussed in a future webinar. The SRSA Act provided additional funding for the GEER program, and LEAs, institutions of higher education, and education-related entities continue to be eligible subrecipients. And also, like CARES GEER, SRSA GEER funds can be used for a variety of activities to address the impact of the pandemic, including supporting the provision of childcare and early childhood education, social and emotional support, and the protection of education-related jobs. Under SRSA GEER, LEAs that received SRSA GEER funds were not required to provide equitable services to non-public schools because, again, Congress had authorized the EANS program to provide that aid. However, states that accepted SRSA GEER funds do agree to comply with the SRSA Act maintenance of effort requirements, which are slightly different from those under the CARES Act. But again, those will be detailed in greater depth at a future learning series. Additional funding for the GEER program was not included within the ARP Act, So the final opportunity to obligate any funds for the GEER program will expire on September 30th of 2023. And any funds that revert through the SGR EANS or EANS programs to be used to support allowable expenses under the GEER 2 program are also available. However, funds that revert to the governor under the SGR EANS program must also be obligated by September 30th of 2023. However, funds that revert to the governor as a part of the EANS program are available for obligation through September 30th, 2024. Under SGR, $2.75 billion of the governor's GEER allocation is dedicated to the EANS program. State education agencies administer the EANS program, and the priority for services and assistance is provided to non-public schools that enroll low-income students and are most impacted by COVID-19. Non-public schools that participated in the Paycheck Protection Program on or after December 27, 2020 are not eligible to receive or to participate in the EANS program. Allowable services or assistance for this program include supplies to sanitize or disinfect and clean schools, improve ventilation systems, COVID testing, educational technology, and addressing learning loss. SGR EANS participating non-public schools may be reimbursed for some, but not all, of the allowable services and assistance. And any EANS funds that were not obligated for services or assistance to non-public schools within 6 months of a state receiving that award are required to revert to the governor for allowable purposes under SGR GEER. States that accepted SGR EANS funds also agreed to comply with the SGR Act maintenance of effort requirements. For EANS, the program is very similar to the SGR EANS program with two significant exceptions. First, only non-public schools with significant enrollments of low-income students and those most impacted by COVID-19 are eligible for the services and assistance under the EANS program. In addition, non-public schools cannot receive reimbursements under EANS like they could under SGR EANS. State education agencies were required with the EANS program to submit an application to the department, and the application had to indicate the significant percentage of low-income students that the state would use to determine what that significant percentage would be and how they would determine those most impacted by COVID-19. The department suggested a significant low-income percentage of 40%, but did allow states to propose different percentages within their plans. Similar to SGR EANS, EANS funds that are not obligated for services or assistance within 6 months of the state receiving an EANS award do revert to the governor for purposes under SGR GEER. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Christopher for the fiscal terms and conditions.
Thank you, Jenny. In addition to the specific program requirements detailed within the statute, assurances for each ESSER, GEER, and EANS award include an assurance to comply with uniform administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements for federal awards, more often referred to as the Uniform Guidance. These will be discussed in greater depth in a future webinar in our Grantee Learning series, and for now, we will reference them in relation to the grantee's responsibilities for monitoring and to bring awareness to the specific resources where these requirements can be found. Uniform guidance requirements in the Code of Federal Regulations are found in 2 CFR Part 200, subparts D and E. Subpart D includes the post-federal award requirements and include requirements for financial management systems, procurement, reports, and records, as well as grant closeout. These requirements also explain the responsibilities of federal awarding agencies and pass-through entities, such as state educational agencies, in awarding, monitoring, and closing out grant awards. Subpart E of the Uniform Guidance includes cost principles, which can assist the state's determination of allowable costs. Cost principles identify what costs may or may not be charged to a grant and how these costs should be classified. Costs charged to a federal assistance award need to be documented as allowable, necessary and reasonable, and allocable. In addition to the requirements within the Code of Federal Regulations, grantees and their subrecipients must also comply with various provisions of the Education Department's General Administrative Regulations, commonly referred to as EDGAR. Some of these provisions include those for state-administered programs, definitions that apply to the department's regulations, the General Education Provision Act, GEPA, and restrictions on lobbying, as well as requirements for drug-free workplaces. Additional terms and conditions related to EDGAR include drug and alcohol abuse prevention, the protection of human subjects, student rights, and family educational rights and privacy. While we will not take time today to explore the regulations with CFR or EDGAR, they are included for your reference, and links to each will be made available within the slides when they're posted up to our announcements page. As we've noted previously, it is the grantee's responsibility to not only comply with the regulations as a grant recipient, but also to monitor its subrecipients throughout the life cycle of its grant award. These regulations should be included within the state's own internal controls and administrative procedures, as well as its monitoring processes with subrecipients. Additional information will be reviewed in future Grantee Learning Series sessions. Grantees can also access the monitoring protocols that have been provided by the department for the ESSER, GEER, and EANS programs. Links to these protocols are included in the resources at the close of today's session. Once the program's period of performance is complete, obligations for funds associated with the program can no longer take place. However, following the end of the award's obligation period, there is a 120-day liquidation period to complete the associated liquidations of expenses obligated within the grant's period of performance. During this time, grantees and subrecipients can continue to draw down funds, and once that time period is ended, the grant will move into a closeout period. In order to close out a grant, several requirements must first be met. The grant period must have expired. The liquidation period must have expired. And there are $0 balance in G5. Or there are no outstanding requests for funds still in the grant account, provided there is a balance. Performance and financial reports and data must have been received and approved. Financial and programmatic issues and findings must be resolved, and all audit findings must be resolved. As we've already discussed, grantees and subrecipients have 120 days to liquidate and draw down funds following the close of the period of performance. This is referred to as the liquidation period. Absent an approved request to additionally liquidate funds, a grant will then move into its suspension period. During this time, funds can no longer be drawn down from G5 as the department and the grantee prepare to close out the award. Reporting, however, for pandemic relief funds will continue for CARES Act and CERSA acted programs well after the suspension period has taken effect. Following the suspension period, SGR will place those grants in manual closeout and conduct manual closeout activities with grantees. Such activities include verifying grant balances and any required return of funds to the department. A grant will be considered closed once all closeout periods, including any final reporting, is complete. For CARES Act funds and also CERSA Act funds, grantees will go into manual closeout. However, again, closeout activities for those grants will not be complete until reporting has been finished in the 2027 and 2028 years respectively. Remaining funds on the grant award will be returned to the Treasury 4 years after the end of each grant's obligation period. Jenny?
Thank you, Christopher. There may be occasions where funds that were properly obligated by the obligation deadline were not able to be drawn down during the liquidation period. The department's longstanding process for late liquidation is what has guided the late liquidation process and the liquidation extension process, and we'll take a little bit of a look at those now. If these liquidations have been completed, the state may apply for a one-time late liquidation drawdown of funds, and the department has provided technical assistance for this process related to the CARES Act ESSER and GEER funds, and those slides and the recording are available and linked on our websites. In order to apply, a state must submit a signed request on letterhead and include all of the components that are listed. It is essential to note that this process may only include those obligations which were made during the period of funding availability and for allowable purposes. Excuse me, sorry. Specific to the CARES and SRSA, ESSER, GEER, and EANS awards, states may also apply for an extended liquidation period of up to 14 additional months to continue the liquidation of timely and valid obligations made pursuant to 34 CFR Section 76-707, which we'll reference momentarily. To streamline that request process for grantees and operationalize the collection and review of grantee requests, SGR developed a liquidation extension request template for grantees to utilize for their requests related to either the CARES, GEER, and ESSER funds or the SRSA, ESSER, GEER, and EANS funds. The request templates require grantee and sub-grantee information regarding obligation and liquidation amounts and grantee attestations regarding the timelines and the allowability of properly obligated expenses, with a continued focus on grantee oversight responsibilities during the extension period. If a grantee has any questions about either the one-time late liquidation request or the liquidation extension request process, they should submit questions to their state mailbox and their assigned program officer at statename.oesc@ed.gov, or for example, alabama.oesc@ed.gov. As a reminder, we want to reference the requirements for obligating and liquidating funds. And so to obligate generally means to make a binding commitment for services, work, or products as detailed within 34 CFR Section 76-707, which stipulate when those obligations are made. And regardless of a state's intention or approval to apply for a one-time late liquidation of funds or liquidation extension, obligations for funds must have been completed by the associated obligation deadline. It should also be noted that certainly in order to be considered properly obligated, the funding must be obligated for allowable uses as provided by the specific funding requirements and allowances of either the ESSER, GEER, or EANS programs. And additional information regarding the allowable uses may be found in the department's published FAQs for each program. CFR 76-707 further details specific types of obligations and the date by which those obligations are considered to be made. And this information also applies to obligated costs included within a liquidation extension. A state or subgrantee should carefully consider whether these differentiations when reporting their properly obligated funds. And of particular note are the obligation of funds for personal services, whether by a state or subgrantee employee or by a contracted employee that is not an employee of the state or subgrantee. So personal services that are provided by an employee of the state or an employee of the subgrantee are obligated when those services are performed. Thus, no personal services may be obligated after the award's obligation deadline. Personal services by a contractor who is not an employee of the state or subgrantee, such as a contract through a third party, are obligated on the date which the state or subgrantee makes a binding written commitment to obtain those services. And then finally, to liquidate simply means to draw down and spend the funds. And a timely liquidation occurs during the period of obligation, i.e. by September 30th of the given year for the program and through those first 120 calendar days after the relevant September 30th date. And as long as obligations have been made by the September 30th deadline for the given program for contracted services, and those obligations are valid or they follow all applicable requirements, then those obligations may be liquidated during the 120 calendar day liquidation period. We've discussed in this session numerous resources that the department has provided to support grantees and their subrecipients in the administration of these funds and the implementation of their related programs. Many of those resources are included here, but of particular note are the ESSER, GEER, and EANS program pages, and those are listed at the top with the asterisks. Our webmaster in SGR has worked to consolidate and organize our program resources, and navigating to those main program pages will provide you access to all of those other related resources, those that are linked here, as well as some additional resources. And also of particular note is our SGR deadlines and announcements page, which includes upcoming deadlines as well as communications made to grantees through G5. And you can access past editions of our office's weekly newsletter, which is distributed at the start of each week and includes a number of reminders and links to other resources. We've also provided some links to other resources from the department, which may prove valuable to you in the administration of your federal grant programs. ED's grants homepage is the department's landing page for a variety of formula and discretionary grant-related resources. The training and risk management tools page includes a variety of resources to assist those charged with implementing the department's discretionary and formula programs with mitigating risk through the grants management process. The grants training courses are a set of 10 courses designed to ensure that the department's grantees, sub-grantees, and other grants management and oversight staff understand and are able to execute their administrative and financial responsibilities within the confines of federal regulations and directives. Application information and the notice of competitions or other announcements are available on ED's Federal Register Notices page, and grants.gov provides a clearinghouse for both online application packages for ED as well as a variety of other grant administration resources. And the grants training resources is a series of trainings that's provided by the U.S. Chief Financial Officers Council, and an overview of all of those trainings is provided in the Introduction to Federal Financial Assistance presentation, which is also linked for you. But of course, your primary resource for technical assistance associated with the ESF programs remains your state mailbox and your assigned program officer. And that concludes our Grantee Learning session for the Grants Administration Overview. Thank you so much for joining us.
We are going to start by addressing some of the questions that have been put into the chat, and I believe they came just to the panelists. So we're going to repeat the questions and just share the responses for everybody. But the first question that came into the chat was, will the slides be available after the presentation? And the answer is yes. The slides and the recorded presentation will be on the Office of State and Grantee Relations website approximately 1 week after this presentation. The second question that came in was regarding ARP-ESSER funds. And the question was, for ESSER 3 or ARP-ESSER requires LEAs to reserve at least 20% of funds to address learning loss. Does ED or the department interpret that to mean LEAs are required to use or expend at least 20% of the ARP-ESSER or ESSER 3 funds to address learning loss? And Christopher, go ahead.
Sure. As I said in the chat to Tammy, hey Tammy, yes, the LEA must use the 20% it reserves from its ARP-ESSER allocation to address learning loss.
And we had one more question in the chat. And again, in a minute, you can come off mute and ask any additional questions. But a third question was, Has Ed, or the department, coordinated the appropriate use of obligated funds after the grant period with the OIG for auditing purposes?
And we have been working with the auditors to understand all of the post-obligation activities, to include ensuring their understanding of the department's approach to implementing late liquidation extensions under the CARES and SERSA program. We also have continued to release new guidance, and I'm guessing that this might be part of what this question is referring to around activities that continue up to and after the liquidation period, depending on your own state's state and local laws guiding your procurement process. Both we have met with and shared that information and that guidance with the OIG and continue to meet with them on a regular basis as it pertains to all pandemic relief programs, and additionally are working to ensure that we provide technical assistance opportunities nationally for auditors so that they have a full understanding of all of the pandemic relief programs and also the department's support to our grantees and the implementation of those programs through the obligation period and through the liquidation period or period of extension.
Christopher, another question that came into the chat just now was, are the maintenance of equity requirements only for fiscal year 22 and 23, or will there be maintenance of equity for fiscal year 24 as well? In other words, the maintenance of equity data due on July 31st, is that the final data collection? And on the 31st, that is the SEA final data collection. But on August 16th, we're going to have another webinar on the maintenance of effort and the maintenance of equity, the information on that. So please be sure to join us then. But yes, the SEA level data on the July 31st is the final data collection. I am checking the chat to see if there is additional questions. I'm not seeing any at this time. Let me see if anybody would like to unmute themselves and ask questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and I'll continue to look in the chat.
If you'd like to ask your question verbally, you can select the raise hand icon in WebEx. You'll hear a beep when your line is unmuted, at which point please and state your name and question. You can still submit your questions using the WebEx chat feature. Just remember to select all panelists from the drop-down menu before submitting your question.
So Sandy, we do have a question from Amber Moore, and the question is related to non-compliance with the reservations that are required under ESSER. And so, yes, both a state and an LEA could be seen to be non-compliant if they are not implementing that particular reservation. How that would be handled obviously would be case specific given the specific circumstances. However, if a state were to find that an LEA has been non-compliant and not fully utilized its 20% reservation to address learning loss, I mean, the expectation of the department, of the grantee as the agent for these funds, is that you would work with that subrecipient to get them into compliance.
One more item. I know I mentioned that July 31st was the last data collection for SEA level maintenance of equity, but the LEA level maintenance of equity data will be due in December, but there will none be required in FY24.
And Sandy, I had another question, or I'm sorry, yeah, another question come in. But I'm not sure if it went to all of the group or if it was sent to me privately. And it again is related to the 20% reservation as it pertains to an LEA that has closed or does not fully expend its ESSER 3 funds by the end of the grant period. I'm going to actually ask that, Amber, you would reach out to your program officer and submit this question. I want to follow up actually with our program attorneys, because there is a world in which that LEA would be seen as non-compliant for a lack of use of its 20% reservation. However, I need to follow up on how that would be implemented in the context of the LEA closing or opting to return a portion of its award. So we will, if you will submit that question to your state mailbox, we will make a point to follow up with you.
I think I see one more in the chat. With ARP, LEAs need to post updates every 6 months for return to learn and uses of funds. When is the last update required to be made? And should LEAs leave their plans up throughout the full time the award stays open?
So again, this is Christopher. So the return to learn and uses of funds plan should remain posted. If an LEA has made changes since their most recent publication of that plan, we would ask that that be updated to reflect the current state. But we do recognize the farther that we become out from the national emergency, making regular updates at the 6-month interval may not be necessary, but we would be validating and would ask that grantees continue to validate that those plans are posted and reflect the most current state within that LEA.
I think one more question just came into the chat. What would your recommendation be if 2 or more districts were to consolidate prior to the end of the ARP ESSER grant period? Is this regarding reporting or?
I think, Christina, if I'm understanding your question correctly, I would interpret it to mean what happens to their ARP ESSER allocations within those two separate LEAs when they combined. I am going to ask that you also submit that question to our state mailbox. I would need to actually consult with our policy folks who have been more intimately involved in sort of those case-specific instances, such as that, where 2 districts have consolidated during the implementation period. With regard to monitoring notifications for the 23-24 school year, I want to just remind folks that we are going to have a monitoring specific session rather in the Grantee Learning series. But what I will say, and we'll speak to more during that particular session, is that we annually run our risk assessment and identify which entities we will be monitoring in the upcoming year during the late summer, early fall. Just in terms of staging, however, we notify states based on a timeline approximately 5 months out from when the actual monitoring event were to occur. When we do that reach out to the states, we also then work with them to identify which LEAs we might include as a partner in that monitoring event. So more to come in that space, but I would encourage you to sit in to learn more about our monitoring, both our monitoring program, let me say, in that particular webinar. Sandy, can I add a quick just bullet point for things monitoring as it pertains to the 23-24 school year? One thing that I do want to note for folks, and you're going to hear us say this in this series, but also if you receive our news flash, you're going to start to receive updates. The next biannual review will be conducted in October to November, with more information being shared out by your program officer at your monthly check-ins in September. But the focus of that review will be on ARP ESSER, and will contain a review of a limited portion of the scope of that program. But we do already anticipate that that review will happen in October and November.
Don't see any more questions in the chat. Again, we have about 2 minutes, and we welcome you to come off mute if you have any additional questions. And if there are no further questions, then we would like to thank all of you for joining us today. And please remember to sign up to attend our webinar next week, which is related to monitoring. And it will also be a live session held Wednesday, August 2nd at the same time, beginning at 2 o'clock Eastern Time. Thank you all for joining us.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.